So before we could start the paint work on all of the parts for the chassis, some of them needed to be glued together prior to painting, as they either needed to be the same color or just needed the seam to be removed. With the gluing done, some of the seams were of course sanded smooth just to make them a little bit less obvious. Then I moved them into the spray booth for a couple coats of primer, and then of course every part got their own color. Some of the parts also needed to be painted in multiple colors, so in some instances they were painted silver first, then masked off and painted flat black, or just the other way around. So most of the main colors were painted with the airbrush. Some of the smaller details were simply just easier to be painted by hand and a small brush and some paints, of course. Pretty much all of the parts in the engine bay are either silver, body color, or black. And just to give it a bit more depth and realism, I decided to change a couple of the tones up with a bit of weathering. So here there is being applied some Panelline accent color on some of those pieces, and also I decided to clear coat some with a matte or even satin finish, and also added a bit of gloss finish here and there too, just to give it a bit more life. Straight out of the box, the engine bay is already fully packed, so I could decide just to leave it there detail-wise, but I did want to add a little bit more. So I drilled out a couple of holes for the ignition wires to be added, and then of course painted that center section of the valve system in a gold-silver finish, as I've seen on some reference pictures, and then I could add all the ignition wires. I let the paint sit and cure for a bit, and then moved on to assembling the main engine parts. Something I do want to add every time that I do add ignition wires, there are some of you that are complaining about the firing order. That is completely incorrect. I personally don't mind, as it's just a small detail that I want to add, and just making sure that all the wires are in their specific places is not something I am too fussed about. So I'm not going to be adding them in their specific correct firing order. I'm just going to add them to add a bit of a look and realism to it and not go overboard. These wires were also really in my way later on in the assembly, but you will find out later. While looking up some reference photos, I did find there was a small detail here as well that was simply added. Some more engine parts were glued in place and a couple of decals, and I could move on to a bit more weathering as well. After finishing up the engine for now, I could set that aside and move on to the chassis and putting that all together. I did find during the assembly that some of these holes and slots were a bit too tight, so they did need a bit more room. Specifically, the ones for these pieces were way too tight and I couldn't really fit them in, so it is a bit of a mess with a gluey blob down there. But that is all later not to be seen after pretty much all the other parts go on top of it. But still, it would be nice to have these parts fitting a bit better. So the holes for these parts needed to be drilled out and the slots needed to be widened a bit for them all to fit properly. So just like the rear axle parts, the engine is also a bit of a tight squeeze with some of the holes not being too big, so drilling them out just a couple sizes larger does make it a lot easier for them to fit nicely together. Earlier on, when I was doing all of the detail painting, I simply forgot to do these parts on the chassis itself, so better late than never. Keep in mind that there is, of course, a left and right hand drive option for this car, so when assembling, some of the parts need to be either for the left hand or right hand drive version. That is clearly stated in the instructions, but it is still possible that you can overlook it. So make sure to check which drive side you have chosen, and of course which parts need to be installed and which don't. With most of the parts now in place, it was time to add even more details from the decal sheet that came with the kit. A lot of nice small decals were included and needed to be added just to liven up the engine bay and make it look even better. When I added the ignition wires to the engine earlier in the video, I wasn't aware that some of these parts needed to go over and under some of these wires, and therefore it would be a bit of a fuss to install them, as you can see right here. So it took a bit of convincing, but in the end it turned out fine, and it fit really well. Well, sort of really well. Some of the wires did get pulled out and needed to be glued back in, and some of them needed to be removed just a little bit in order for that part to fit underneath and in place properly. But in the end, I guess it turned out fine. In one of the earlier episodes, a subscriber commented really kindly with a file that he created for these wheels. The wheels from the kit suck pretty badly and don't really look all that good. Now luckily he designed a full set of these wheels that fit perfectly to the kit itself. The actual sizing is identical, the look is really well done as well, and you can see through them. They have spokes on both the front and rear side and are completely detailed. These of course needed to be 3D printed first. I will leave a link for the file in the description down below if you're interested. So with the wheels now printed and cleaned, as you can see, the detail is insane. You can look straight through all of the spokes. It has a lot more detail than the wheels that came with the kit and just makes it a whole lot better. The wheels were then cut off of the sprues, or the supports so-called, and cured. After curing, I moved them into the spray booth, applied some primer first. I'm using some Tamiya gray primer. This is suitable for plastic, metal, and also really works well on resin. Then they were painted in a flat black. You could also paint it in gloss black. For the Molotow, it doesn't really matter, I have found. And then of course some Molotow chrome was applied to make it a really nice chromy finish. Keep in mind, somehow this chrome paint does require a lot of time to cure, so don't handle it too soon after. I let it dry for a couple of days and it still left a bit of an imprint, so that needed to be fixed. I just took out one of those markers and applied a bit more and it was completely gone. But on the other side, I decided to add them from the inside out, and that didn't leave a mark on the knock-on for the wheel itself. With the tires on, they could all be glued in place, and that pretty much finished off the chassis work.